basically your raison d'être completely. You know, why are you writing this research to begin with? You know, I mean, from what Nariman said, problem, new, etc., etc. And Dr. Randa has been talking about contribution. The why is really why your research is important. Does it fill a gap? You know, is it adding something new? Now, novelty is a huge issue because you're always told that you're supposed to contribute something. Now, we all know that all research is old and all research is new, depending how you look at it. You know, I mean, we're basically using a certain number of tools to talk about a certain number of texts. You know, looking at it very narrowly, no one adds anything new in the research. But on the other hand, this is the nature of our research. We're not like the scientists. We're not like medical students. We're not about experimentation. We're not about finding a new medicine. We are about a different approach to a new text, a question that was not asked before, a different angle, a different point of view. So you really have to have answers to these questions very clear in your mind as you do your own research. This is what I'm doing. This is why. Now, how is what takes us to combining your corpus with the approach. How are you going to work with your topic? Right? Now, this brings in, of course, the methodology. Now, as you will see, they're interwoven and interrelated, and you cannot disentangle them. You know, the methodology is sometimes precisely why you're contributing something to research. You know, Dr. Randa said that sometimes you start finding a topic from a genre, or from a period, or from an author. I think you can also start from a methodology, from a literary school, from a school of criticism. This is what I want to do. How do I mean, I want to work with this school. What text do I apply to? Or texts? How do I approach it from a different perspective, comparatively? Or, now Dr. Randa, as we were preparing this, kept quoting something that Dr. Malak Hashim always said. Are we applying new methodology to old topics, or is it applying old methodology to new topics? Now,
say that again.
Is it new methodology applied to old topics, or old texts, or old methodology applied to new topics? And I think in the combination of these two is precisely your contribution, what you come up with, that you're using a text that has been read and reread and criticized and reviewed and revised a million times, but you're applying a new approach to it. Or you're taking an old approach and testing it on a new text. Of course, if you do new methodology with new texts, that is the true contribution. But then again, you run the risk of not finding enough resources to work with. You know, I mean,
may I say here that there's a lovely, lovely book by someone I think called Du Bois. I'll write the name of the book and the writer, and I'll put it up in the library downstairs for everybody to look at. You know what he's doing? He took The Great Gatsby, one book, and he has something like 7 or 8 chapters in the book. Each chapter is analyzing the same book, The Great Gatsby, from a different approach, a critical point of view. Like he starts with the new critics, and then he goes on to more modern ones like historicism or deconstruction, or just name it. I mean, 7 different approaches applied to the same book. What do you expect to bring out of the book under this approach, which cannot be brought out under another approach? And so you keep comparing the different approaches and what they can do to the same thing. Now, what's lovely about this book is that he's handling the same text, not different text. When you handle different text, the variables are different and you get lost. But when you're handling the same text and you see what it brings out every time, I think you should read this book because you will know what approach really means here. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, all you need to do to test this is visit. Just pay a visit to our library, to our department library. Look at all the research that was done on the same text a million times. But again, it's the approach. How do you approach it? What is it that you're trying to say about it that no one else has said before? Basically, I think that's the whole. I don't want you to get too stuck on the idea of a contribution. But doing the research itself is a contribution. Now, one of the areas that can highlight your contribution and that can enable you to come up, in fact, with contribution is that interaction zone between the text and the methodology, the text and the approach. And I want you to keep this in mind all the time, that how do you integrate the two? How do you combine your text with your approach? Just give me an idea of how you envision you can do this. You're writing a thesis now. You're dividing it into, say, 4 chapters. Where would you put your theory? Any introduction, which would be your first chapter. And then?
Ideally, I should apply this approach to my application. So if I have, I don't know, I can't think about my own thesis simply because the approach that I'm using is unapplicable. I can't really practically, or maybe I'll learn that later, but I can't practically put it into action. But if I am using, for example, signifier kind of thing, structural approach to a certain text, I have to see that's the sign in the text, and it signifies this, and that's the result. I have to apply. I don't know if I'm clear enough, but application. I don't have to forget about it. I can't. Ideally, I have to apply it. It's like A, B, C. This is the theory, and in the text, A stands for this, B stands for that, C stands for that, and then I don't know. That's what I do.
You want to say something now?
Yeah.
Yes.
I myself find the problem of weaving the theory with the analysis to have a decent academic thing. يعني to read it and find it that it's حاجة محترمة يعني.
Okay, how is someone with حاجة محترمة? This is something that we have to negotiate all the time as we do research and as we present that research in the form of the proposal. How and where am I going to include the theory? Now, when we come to the stages of the proposal itself, we'll find it is divided into certain categories. You cannot mix them, and you have to keep the logic in mind. And we'll talk about that later. This discourages you to mix the theory with the text. Now, forget about this. We'll come to it later. As you write, where do you place your theory? Most people put a theoretical introductory chapter in the beginning, explaining this is the theory that I'm going to use. I am going to use Derrida's work. I'm going to use Edward Said's work. I'm going to use structuralism. I'm going to use post-structuralism, feminism, etc. And then do I dump it there in the beginning and leave it? Now I want to move on to the text. And I want to enjoy analyzing the text. Right? So, khalas, I've done my share of... Now, it all has to do with how you envision research. Research, if you are coming up with something new, then you have to negotiate that zone, the point of interaction between the text and the method. Now, I want to remind you that choosing a methodology is not just about giving weight to your research. It's also about finding tools how to approach your text. So of course, yes, you have to have a theoretical background section in the beginning, muhtaram, solid, that sort of provides the grounding for the basic grounds for your research, but then you don't want to forget about it. You always have to be aware of what tools you're going to use in approaching your text. And that is what surfaces again in your analysis. And that is how you present something new that no one has done before. I mean, the example that Nariman gave was fantastic because here it is, I'm working with structuralism. What are my tools? I have to look at signifiers, signifiers. I have to look at binary oppositions. I have to look at numerators and denominators. I have to do, these are my tools. This is the language that I'm going to use in analyzing my texts. This is how I'm going to approach them. This entails, of course, that you are in full control of your methodology. And I cannot impress this upon you strongly enough. It's extremely important to know what methodology you're using, to understand it, to read research that is written, applying it, to show yourself, to teach yourself and sort of inform yourself more about how other people use it, and criticize how other people use it, and find fault with how other people use it. As the case may be. Of course, it depends who's writing and what they're using and how they're using it. But reading other research that is completely irrelevant to my topic is extremely important. It's part of how you sort of build up that research culture. A lot of the mechanics that we'll deal with later on in the proposal itself come out of this, come out of familiarizing yourself with how other people have done it. You need to read other theses that have been, especially that have been praised by your colleagues and by your professors. First of all, because you can't be out there in the dark. It's not just you and your topic, and that's the end of it. It's not like that. There has to be that dialogue all the time. We are researchers. We read all the time just to enlighten ourselves, just to keep up to date with new material that's being done, just to generate new ideas, just to have intelligent discussions with each other and learn from each other. So this is very important. Now, this is one way of developing your tools, reading other people that have used it. But also, you want to find your own way of approaching your text using those tools. This is your contribution. Yes?
May I add here that once you choose your approach, the method you're going to apply, you become, I like analogies because they bring the idea clearer to beginners. You become like a judge in a courtroom. The approach has the upper hand, becomes the master, and you are just a catalyst. زي القاضي ما بينه القاضي catalyzes the law and the case. He has no say in it, you see. الجudge في الواقع ما عندوش say. الjudge is just a knowledgeable person who knows the law. He catalyzes the law and the case. And this is the researcher. He catalyzes the approach and the data, the material you're working with. This is what I called a straitjacket at the beginning. You become the servant almost of the approach you have selected. And so before you select your approach, you have to be very careful. Very, very careful. Because this is what is going to master or control your research. you are not free to say anything, you're not free to do anything, you are controlled by what you have selected as a method. So this is just what I wanted, because sometimes people think that research is just a free world. No, it's not a free world, it's a straitjacket. Very, very confining.
Thank you. Well, of course, once you commit to a certain methodology, you have to follow that methodology. You cannot propose research doing a deconstructionist approach to Virginia Woolf's text, and then later on suddenly revert to use Darcy. You have to stick to your approach, which is why it's very important to spend as much time as you want deciding how you're going to approach your text. I'll come back to your habit in a second. But I just wanted to go back to something that Dr. Randa was talking about. Of course, we have some psychological considerations at the end of the workshop. But one of the problems we have is we get stuck in the middle and we don't know how to continue. And I think part of the reason, a huge chunk of the reason, is we don't have the right approach. You know, if you have the right approach, if you know how to approach your text with that approach, it just generates itself. You know, you keep on working. And if that is not working for me, I'll leave it, I'll do something else now. But sometimes when you're not in control of your method, you approach a text. That's as much as I want to say about it. This does not constitute a chapter. I will leave it for now. I will get maybe new ideas. Well, new ideas do not fall on you from heaven. They don't. You know, they come out of brainstorming, they come out of discussions with other people, they come out of reading more about your research or in a method that is related to your research, and they certainly come out of continuity and sustenance. You know, the more you write, even if you think it's not important, the better ideas you get later on, and then later you can discard what you think irrelevant. Now, have you had a question?
Yes, I had a question regarding what Dr. Salo has just said about the researcher being a servant to the approach and that he has no say. I beg to differ, because I think that if I take up an approach and I continue working with it for some time and then it yields results that are contrary to what I understand, then I must I think I must say this, and I must negotiate with the approach itself. I don't think I'm a servant to it.
I think we're talking about two different things.
May I answer? May I answer? If your approach leads to something contrary to what you had in mind at the beginning, then you are approaching your research in the wrong way. Don't approach your research with any preconceptions. Let your approach work and lead you to a result. If you come to research with preconceptions, you're not a researcher. Don't come with ideas like, I think this is so and so and I want to prove that. You cannot do that. This is blasphemy in research. You come to research with a free mind, like, all right, I have my data, I have my material, and I have my approach, and I'll just bring them together and see what the explosion is going to result in, okay? And this is a good research, a catalyst, not a preconceived idea. A preconceived idea, a hunch, yes, but sometimes we have a hypothesis which says, yes, this is going to happen. And then my hypothesis is null at the end of the research, like, it did not happen. So I say, my first hunch was wrong, my hypothesis was not validated, and so the opposite is true. So this is how you approach your research.
Let me just
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Let me build on this using another analogy. It's like a marriage. You know, of course, once you get married to someone, you're committed to that person. you should do a lot of research in the beginning, and you should do a lot of homework to decide that you want to be committed to this person.
And it's a proposal.
Different kind of. Once the proposal is made, proposition, and once you're committed to that person, are you at their service?
No.
God forbid. Yes, right? Of course. I mean, negotiations all the time, testing all the time. But that's the person that you're married to. You're not free to be with anyone else. You know? Once you decide on a methodology, and that's why I'm saying preparatory research is very, 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 very important. Just don't jump to something because it's a fad or because it's fashionable or because everybody else is working with it. Now, Mariam, you mentioned a fantastic topic, eco-criticism, and you know, it's very fashionable these days to work with eco-criticism. I just decide tomorrow that I want to do an eco-critical reading of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. But how? I mean, it sounds like a fantastic topic, but is it something I can really work with? Is it something I can prove something looking at? That is what you need to decide on preliminarily before you work with your research. Now, you have chosen a certain approach in a certain text, and then you are aware of your tools, but looking at specific text, one of the tools does not work. Now, there are other approaches, and we don't want to be afraid of combining approaches. You know, certain research cannot be done with a single approach. You know,
So the eclectic,
sorry?
combining approaches is an eclectic approach.
It could be, you know, you can do it in a variety of ways. You can choose a certain method and not apply it completely. I mean, this is tricky here. We have to be clear when we say not apply it completely. You have to be very clear as you explain your methodology that this is what concerns you in this methodology in relevance to this topic. But I'm not concerned with this and that. Let me give you an example from my research. When I did my PhD on text and image, on adaptation. Of course, a lot of this had to be done through semiotics. This was my tool. You're looking at the visual, the audio-visual, and the nonverbal. So you have to use semiotics. Now, in semiotics, you can get into very, very murky grounds. It becomes very mathematical. You approach the text like a mathematical formula. This is not what I'm interested in. And I had to clarify from the start, this is not the semiotic variety that I'm using. I'm using semiotics in this way. Now, because I was working with 3 different texts and 3 different films, I had to resort to other approaches. In certain cases, it was feminism. In another case, it was post-colonialism. Now, you have to keep that open mind. I mean, don't be afraid of experimenting with different approaches, of sort of adapting the approach to your text rather than adapting the text to your approach. And don't be afraid of correcting yourself as you go along. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind, you're always working with what, why, and how at any given stage of your research. You're always working with the topic, you always have a purpose, and you want to make a contribution, and you always want to do that in a way that is logical and that serves the purposes of your research to the maximum. Now, I want to move to the next stage, which is doing preliminary research. Now, you more or less have a topic, you more or less have an approach. Now, you move on to preliminary research. What do you think you're doing as you're doing preliminary research?
I'm reading like material that relates to the topic and the approach. Papers that have been written, like let's say I'm doing feminism in school, so I read material that has to do with feminism.
Okay, we're at an earlier stage still. We are at the stage of I want to work on Shakespeare and I want to use new historicism. Okay? Yes?
Maybe trying to find elements, certain elements in the theory I'm using that could be applied to the text, or like reading the theory itself and the text, and trying to find a connection between it, and seeing if this approach is applicable or not.
Okay, listen to me again. I want to work on Shakespeare. I am interested in new historicism. That's the stage I am at. What else do I need to do? Where do I go from this point?
Okay, it might be a little bit general, but I believe that this stage is a little bit general. I cannot narrow down, or I cannot jump to connections and links and this kind of thing now. So this might be a bit childish, but it worked for me. If I am working on Shakespeare, let's take this example, fine, a little bit of a biographical approach. I have to read about this writer. I have to read a lot. It might give me some ideas, and then if I have already decided on the text, it's wonderful. If I haven't decided on the text, so it might take time, but I have to read the text. Yeah, it's a little bit preliminary at this stage. And then, as I go on, automatically I will find myself being narrowed down. But I believe that preliminary research is reading broadly about primary evidence, the writer, what he wrote, the period he's writing in, and then the methodology. But I have to decide first on what.
Okay, let me just respond to this and I come back to you. The stage I'm talking about is a very preliminary stage. I want to do post-colonial reading of Shakespeare. Now, the first thing I need to do is identify my primary sources. You know, which of Shakespeare's plays? Am I working with the tragedies or the comedies? Which period? Which stage? You know, for what purpose? And what am I combining them with? Do I want to do something comparative? Do I want to do something English and Arabic or English and French, depending on what language I can read, etc. So, deciding on primary sources, also deciding on what variety of post-colonialism I'm going to use. Now, post-colonialism, you know, how many books have been written under the general umbrella term post-colonialism? Am I going to use Barbara Hallow or Ashcroft, Edward Said? You know, is it Orientalism? What variety and what approach? And even then, you have to think to narrow down further certain primary sources. This is the stage I was looking at. Now we all jump to the next stage, which is what Nariman was talking about, and this is reading around your topic. Now, many of you have hands up, and let's listen.
My research, for example, I did some preliminary research. First of all, I made a definitions for my terminology. Because it's a new topic in my department, and some it's about to look like articles, not regular research, about the main ideas which I can use in my research, and make it in separate papers, and maybe I use it after.
The hands were, yes.
We have a problem with the way criticism is handled. Yani we graduate, we do not have enough ideas, we do not have this knowledge about the schools of criticism in the first place. Yani we need to start educating ourselves about the different methodologies and the different approach, and this takes forever. Just to get to know the approach and the schools beneath the approach. And in my own proposal, when I went for the Microsoft test, they were fighting over the approach because the different professors belong to different trends inside the approach. So the feedback I got was that I can't handle this approach, and it's very famous. It's formalism. Yani, supposedly I can't do it. But I was shocked, and it was a very big surprise for me that there is this much arguments inside formalism, and I graduated not knowing that. So we have this problem of what is this approach in the first place, and what are the representative texts that I must know to say that I know the school and I can work with it.
Thanks very much for identifying this. I mean, it takes us a little bit off topic, but it's very important to do. Yes, theory is extremely, extremely important. And I have to say, yes, we, as a department, we have a shortcoming in that. I mean, we're trying to remedy that. More and more people now are reading theory as before they graduate, certainly more than I did as an undergraduate in the department. You know, you've got your preliminary year for the master's and for the PhD. You've got your supervisor to suggest certain readings. You have to familiarize yourself with modern theory. How do you do that? I mean, there are readers all over the place. You know, I mean, I teach this textbook in 4th year. It's basically a digest of modern literary criticism. You know, 20th and 21st century, starting with new criticism, moving onwards to the latest school. You have to read constantly, you know, and not just for the current project that you're working on. Familiarize yourself with what is going on, because it can open up new areas for you. But this is what I was also trying to say. Now, you've raised this question of using formalism, applying it to a certain text, and there are many trends and many approaches to formalism itself. Of course, there are. You have to be aware of all of this, and you have to be in total control of what precisely you want to use and what you don't want to use. This does not come out of any place except reading.
Yes, the problem is I discovered that the approach is so far is totally wrong, because I'm working on T.S. Eliot from a romantic point of view, and working with formalism on new criticism brought to me completely futile, because it's like reading Eliot by Eliot. So I was surprised that they were fighting over the approach, and they didn't notice that the approach is from the beginning is not the right one.
Right.
And also the idea of guidance, who to go to when you have this problem, because criticism is not a clear, specialization, if I can say. I don't know who to go to if you have a problem about methodology, because the supervisor is usually very well read on the topic or on the genre, and on the poetry, on the novel, but the school, the technicalities of the school, who to go to discuss that.
Well, this is the research community that we've spoken about a lot so far, and I think it's extremely important. It's something we have to train ourselves to do. You know, if you have a problem with the methodology, of course, I mean, it depends. I mean, there are degrees of problems. I mean, sometimes I'm using an approach that will not ever, not in a million years, answer my question, not negatively, not positively. Then I've chosen the wrong approach. Or I've chosen the wrong approach for this text. Or this text does not have those elements. I mean, remember, creative writers write their own free will. You know, they are not bound by schools of criticism. So a certain approach might not work with a certain text at all. You know, because it's a different ideology or a different assumption. But we're talking about a problem where I have a reasonable methodology to approach a reasonable text, and there is a bare minimum of appropriateness there. Now, who do I go to when I have a problem applying my methodology, or understanding a certain concept, or a certain tool? Now, our advisors are there to help us with problems, but they are not gods. And they don't know everything in the world. No one in the world knows everything in the world. I need to identify certain people that I can approach and talk to and discuss things with. You know, I'm working on something related to Dennis Brutus. I know that Dr. Randa has written some research on Dennis Brutus. It would be a shame not to go and talk to her. You know, I mean, of course you have to negotiate, and you have to do this very tactfully. You know, with your supervisor. I mean, it all depends on who my supervisor is, what their approach to life is. Basically, the self-supervisors will get offended. I cannot do this on my own. I cannot just go and talk to Dr. Randa and say, Dr. Randa, I want you to read this chapter before I submit it to my advisor. You have to be careful too. Right? But you could suggest that tactfully and nicely to your advisor. This is what I think I need to do. Who do you think I should approach, etc., etc. It's all, research is all the time about finding resources. Who can help me get a text? Who can get me, who can discuss a certain idea in a way that will generate more ideas for me to work with, etc., etc. Now, just to go back to our research, we've done our preliminary research, and as we were saying, here you're identifying your primary sources and also their availability. Remember, we have to be realistic, we have to think of where we are, we have to think of what we're doing and whether or not we can do it. Now suppose you want to work with a certain topic and you're not going to be able to provide the resources or the sources for it. What do you do?
Yes, I ask for the help of, I do this all the time, for the help of other professors, and if I reach like a dead point, a dead end, خلاص, I think, I don't know, but maybe you'll have to change, to order them, yes, if you can. But this is a question, you're not asking about if from the beginning I know that I will have no way to get any material. Is this your question?
Yeah, my question is about, suppose at the preliminary reading stage, I discovered that there isn't enough criticism written on this, for example. Or there is criticism that I'm not going to be able to have access to. There are so many ways of handling this. You can order it, you can ask a colleague to get it, you can read something online, you can read an ebook, you can do whatever you want. One thing you cannot do is compromise your research because of scarcity of material. You cannot do that. It's not acceptable. So you have to think of your research all the time. That is your focus, that is your goal. Right?
A researcher is a boring person.
Absolutely.
He doesn't gossip, he doesn't entertain himself. Living with the research all the time.
But actually,
very boring.
Now, this is how we're also, as we do our research, we create loopholes for ourselves to be more interesting. And this is the next stage that I want to talk about, which is reading around your topic. Now, you've identified your topic, you know what primary sources you're going to use theoretically and creatively, you know more or less what you're writing about. You should always keep yourself informed around the topic.
This is called contextualizing. You contextualize.
This is for casting a wide net, yes, and for also putting your topic in context. As we said, I want to work on Othello. I want to do a post-colonial reading of Othello. I'm not just going to read Othello.
And that's written Othello alone, for example.
Othello and many other texts by Shakespeare and many other writers around Shakespeare. If Shakespeare belongs to a certain movement, you should read about the movement. If I'm working with Edith Wharton, I need to know what kind of society Edith Wharton lived in. What were people like at the time? What did they write about? What did they not write about? Was she innovative or was she reactionary? This is reading around your topic, right? You can read for period, for movement, for genre, for school of criticism. It's very, 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 very important. As you do this, two things you have to keep in mind. Your focus, because often you can get carried away. You just have to find that middle point between reading too much and reading too much. if you read too little, you are not reading. I mean, research is about knowing. It's about finding out. It's about exploring. And you should be able, after writing a research piece, you should be in a position to talk about that research knowing. To talk about that author or that book knowing. A lot of this comes from reading around the topic. You also don't want to read so much that every day you come up with a new idea. Yeah, this is fantastic. I haven't thought about it. I'm going to do this. I'm going to put this in.
2004.
You have to negotiate that middle ground between two. And you have to learn to discard material that you have read. And you have to learn to discard, which is even harder, material that you have written. You know, because seriously, I mean, we all find so much difficulty composing a paragraph that when we have a 35-page chapter, we are very reluctant to cut it down to 30. But sometimes in this 4 or 5 pages lies the secret to the chapter. It reads much better. It reads a lot more focused. You know?
It's very difficult.
You can apply this same logic to everything as you do your own research. You know, I want to be knowledgeable, but I also don't want to be so knowledgeable that I get distracted. So, reading around your topic. Now, the next stage is reading for your topic. You're reading other research that was written about this specific author, this specific play, this specific approach to this play, etc., etc. Right? What are you doing here? I mean, of course, you're going towards more focus, but what do you think is the purpose of this? I mean, what new things can you learn about your research as you read for your research?
Refining it, knowing its strengths and weaknesses, and also guiding myself, because then when I read more for the research itself, when I'm more focused, I know better what that I need to just do away with, and I'm not going to look at again, and then what are the more relevant points that I should channel my research into, perhaps.
And where are the gaps?
Sorry?
And where are the gaps? Like, I mean, the more I read, the more I can read, whether, I mean, because maybe I might discover that my podcast would already been done, like the 101 book, so there's no point in doing it.
Okay, now, if at this stage you discover that your topic has already been done, you're in trouble. Because you should have discovered this much earlier. You know, during the preliminary research and during the reading around the topic. If you've not been able to identify it, of course it happens. You know, but again, I don't want you even to be afraid of this. If this happens, what do you do? I mean, one of the options is you could discard the topic altogether and go back to square one and spend another 6 years working on another topic, and you can go on doing this ad infinitum. But you can also fine-tune and refine what you're working with. Maybe I'm not going to approach it from this angle, I'm going to approach it from another angle. Maybe that other person's research will show me something that I was not aware of. Basically, at this stage, you're testing hypotheses. You know, certain questions that you have in mind, when you talk about the research questions later on, you thought you were going to approach this text in this way. As you read more for your topic, you realize that you need to approach it in a different way. Or that this is going to be very similar to some other research that was done, so I need to hear it differently. You're also at this stage identifying certain problem areas that may face you. Of course, you don't have to resolve them now, but you need to be aware of them later on. You know, remember, when you're writing a thesis, you have an introduction, you have certain chapters, and you have a conclusion. And part of what you're doing is when you conclude, I mean, a lot of us don't know how to conclude, because I said everything that I wanted to say in the chapters, and I concluded each and every chapter. But you want to look holistically at the thesis as an entire whole, and maybe this is where you can suggest potential future research. This is where you can identify some of the problems that this methodology has caused working with this topic. Now, here, as you're reading for your topic, one of the things that you're doing is possibly taking a mental note that this approach may work in this respect, but not in that. And I need to be aware. Maybe I need to re-chapter my thesis. Maybe I need to add another angle that I didn't think of before. Maybe I need to exclude something because it's already been proved and tested. You know, this is a great chance to do this. Also identify those problem areas. Now, there were a lot of hands. I mean, I'm nearly done with this part.
I have like 20 minutes for discussion.
But before we move on to that, I want to remind you it's extremely important, as you do all of this, to take down notes. You don't ever want to go to a library, spend an entire day reading 3 chapters from a book, going home, feeling completely satisfied. 6 months later, you have completely forgotten what was in that book, and you don't know how to use it. And you need to read it again. Now, Dr. Randa uses cards.
I'm old-fashioned.
Right? I mean, this is how we were taught to do research. I don't do this. I photocopy a chapter, I take it with me, I use a highlighter, and I write down notes. You know, so that when I look at the chapter again, or when I look at the book again, I mean, the highlights are basically for areas that I can quote or use as secondary sources, and my comments tell me this is relevant to this point. You know, this is post-colonial. This is something to do with history. This is autobiographical. And then I'll work with it later. You want to use an iPad? Use an iPad. You want to use your own computer? Use your own computer. You want to write on your own skin? Do whatever you want. Do what works for you. You know, highlight, mark, do whatever works for you. But you have to have something you can refer to later on. You know, I've read this book about, I mean, that's extremely important for my research. For the life of me, I can't remember where I read it, what it was exactly. It was talking about. You have to have notes to remind us.
I'd like to suggest another method that I've always used, and it really worked with me, as you just heard here, use what works with you. When I read a chapter, I summarize it, because summarizing can do 2 things at the same time. You have the gist of the chapter with you if you don't want to photocopy. If you want to refer to it, you will refer to something shorter than the chapter, and you make sure that you understand, because unless you understand, you won't be able to summarize. When you summarize, you know that you've understood at least the gist of the chapter, what the writer is trying to do, and what conclusions he comes to, and this is what you really need to know about the chapter. So summarizing always works with me.
It does. I mean, and in your biography courses, you always do annotated bibliography. You know, this is, I mean, whatever method works for you, you have to have this book or this chapter in a digest. You have to be able to go back and read it if you need it. You have to have a summary of it, an annotation of it. However it works for you, you need to identify, and this works on a personal case-by-case level. I mean, each and every one of us does this differently for their own research. You know, I have an iPad, whatever you do. You have to have like the little bashana that they take into the exams that tells you this book is about